give it another. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is David Grombowski, and I'm here to welcome you as director to the, I'm here to welcome you to our seminar today, the UW experience of hosting Tent City 3, a homeless encampment in 2017 and 2020. This seminar today is hosted by the Center for Health Innovation and Policy Sciences in the School of Public Health. I'm the director of the center. And one thing that I'd like to just mention briefly about the center is that in the past year, we've been striving to develop a focus on health equity. And part of that focus is trying to take a deeper dive into some of the drivers of health equity in populations, which includes drivers such as social determinants of health, of which housing and homelessness is one of the key drivers. To that end, Amy Hagopian has partnered with Jessica Jones-Smith to spearhead a work group on housing and health, which is a cluster of faculty and students that are pursuing and pushing homeless policy and research activities. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology, otherwise known as CSDE, and the Urban at UW for partnering with us in this seminar today. So with that, I wish to hand it over to Amy Hagopian, who's going to introduce the seminar and our panelists today. And I hope, and I welcome everyone who's here today to attend this exciting seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to my fellow panelists for joining me here today. We are really excited about launching this seminar series. This will be the first of 4 to be done this year on homelessness and its various manifestations, and we'll tell you more about the other 3 a little bit later. We do have a website, welcome you to visit that. We will have several speakers today. Aliyah Shabir is a student on the Tent City Collective, and Orlando Latimer and Sean Smith are here with Tent City 3. And Lois Thetford is here with the medical school Medex training program faculty. And Catherine Cornforth is here with the UW's Community Engagement Center. And Sally Clark is here with the UW Director. She's the Regional and Community Relations Director. I'll do much more extensive introductions shortly, but I just wanted to give you a preview. I'm going to start this seminar by giving you just a smidgen of background about Tent City 3 and the homeless encampments in Seattle that are legally sanctioned and operate in a democratic, self-governed way, so that you'll understand the context for this conversation. So Tent City 3 was Seattle's first and perhaps most famous tent camp allowed by the city. Our city's system of self-governed encampments and tiny house villages is organized by some groups called Share, Wheel, and Nicholsville. These are unique in the country. They've been operating now, some of them for a couple decades. And while they operate on a shoestring, their work is really impressive. And I have been taking my students to visit these encampments for years because I think their self-governed model is so remarkable. A King County judge about 20 years ago saw no reason why people experiencing homelessness for reasons of destitute poverty should be treated any differently from those who, for example, might have lost their home due to a fire or an earthquake. And the court system therefore sort of muscled the city into negotiating the terms for tent cities to operate continuously across the county in a legal way. So this is a picture of the what they call the consent decree under which Tent City 3 has been operating since then. There have been several numbered tent cities. Some have been bulldozed or abandoned. Currently, the remaining numbers are Tent City 3, Tent City 4, and then Tent City 5 has renamed itself as Dignity Village. Peter House and I taught a 2-quarter public health class in 2009 that produced a feasibility study for UW hosting Tent City 3. But the then president of UW, Mark Emmert, rejected the idea, and still the idea persisted, and eventually students produced again a robust case for hosting the tent city and gathered support from ASUW, our undergrad student organization, GPSS, the Graduate and Professional Student Senate, and our Faculty Senate. Typically, Tent City 3 hosts include religious institutions who give over a parking lot or extra space around their facilities. But Seattle University remarkably broke ground by being the first university in our region to host Tent City 3 in 2005. It may not have been the first university in the country to do so. It is a religious institution, and other religious universities have done this, as did, for example, Seattle Pacific University in 2012, 2014, and again in 2018, again, a religious institution. But they have hosted 3 times. And then Tent City Collective, a UW student-led organization, made the case for hosting Tent City when we got a new UW president, Anna-Marie Kause. And while she suffered some slings and arrows for her commitment to host Tent City 3, she agreed to the stay in 2017 and was a very enthusiastic champion and made this possible. We hosted again in 2020, even though the pandemic was underway. And for both of these stays, Sally Clark was the UW administrator responsible for the various elements required to make the stay successful. Also for both stays, UW Master of Public Health students conducted evaluations. So now I'm going to introduce Aliyah Shabir, who is a leader in that UW student group, Tent City Collective, which works to support Tent City 3 wherever it is based. And by the way, they just moved to Phinney Ridge Lutheran Church. So if you want to go visit them there, they do welcome visitors. She is set to graduate from UW with a Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience and Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology this June. She's worked as a teaching assistant for several courses and served a 3-year term as facilitator of the Husky Experience Student Advisory Council. Thank you for being here, Aliyah. And you get about 7 minutes, and then we will turn it over to our friends at Tent City itself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. I am the student representative for Tent City Collective, or TCC, as we refer to ourselves. TCC is a registered student organization that was actually formed around September 2013, so way before even the first TC3 stay, and to kind of build upon what former students have learned and continue the work of bringing a Tent City encampment to campus. So back then, TCC had contacted 10 cities and actually developed a very long-standing relationship with Tent City 3. And back then, members of TCC spent about 1 year visiting TC3 in its different locations, forming relationships and conducting interviews with residents to learn about their health and other essential needs. And residents would also report feedback and often attributed positive and meaningful sentiments to the times when TC3 was hosted. So flash forward to June 2016, President Anna-Marie Kause agreed that the UW would host TC3 for 90 days in winter of 2017 in the W35 parking lot. And so what we did back then was help provide guidance between UW students and faculty to Tent City 3 and build connections between community members, the University of Washington, Foundation and Tent City 3. We would host educational and outreach events for students, in addition to hosting panels and workshops on houselessness and related issues. Personally, I myself actually joined Tent City Collective in January 2019. So this was a few years after the first day, and this was at a time in which student leadership and membership in TCC had turned over. And in an effort to reignite student interest and engagement, the collective had begun to reform under the help of our faculty advisors. And so our goals back then were twofold. Our goals was to work with President Cause's office and advocate for another responsible stay of Tent City 3 on campus, and then to also reestablish our relationship with Tent City 3 so that their needs and desires are met throughout the process, and ultimately serve as that bridge between Tent City 3 and the UW community. So back then, our activities varied from quarter to quarter. For approximately every quarter or 90 days since then, we would assist Tent City 3 in their moves. We could help them break down tents. We would babysit children and pets, or just unload or load trucks, or basically whatever other needs they had at the time. We would meet bi-weekly, inviting Tent City 3 members and leadership to attend and provide their input on our advocacy process. And then kind of that following year, from 2019 to 2020, we would also organize donation drives, both potluck dinners at TC3 in collaboration with students at Medex, the physician assistant program, and the schools of nursing and public health. And then in June 2019, we actually began our formal efforts to persuade the UW administration, President Anna Marie Cause, to commit to a 2020 or 2021 hosting. We would actually meet monthly and update them on the progress of Tent City Collective's work and continue to gather support from the UW colleges, student organizations, and community members. And eventually, through that year, we laid the groundwork for a logistic framework for the TC3 stay at UW. Unfortunately, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic presented several challenges to our communities, and due to several reasons, we had to actually push the Tent City 3 stay to winter 2021. But despite remote meetings, troubles with student engagement, and difficulties kind of coordinating, we were still able to spend that next year and a half redefining our mission, organizing ourselves, and preparing for the stay. Later that fall, we actually organized a fundraiser with Together UW. And that fundraiser went live, and along with some of our previous fundraising efforts from the 2017 state, we were actually able to raise a couple $1,000s to support Tent City 3. And then during autumn 2020, which was the quarter leading up to the stay, and winter quarter 2021 itself, we kind of went into full drive. Tent City Collective went to full drive. And again, a lot of the success that we believe we achieved with the stay was due to connecting to our community partners, from our nursing students, from the faculty advisors, the Medex students, the dental students, University District Street Medicine, and more. Because together we're actually able to help establish foot care, medical care, dental care, veterinary care with One Health for residents and their pets during the stay. Some of the other things we did was we led bi-weekly tech support workshops to help residents sign up for Medicaid and food camps, help them sign up for vaccinations for COVID. Again, connecting them to other academic resources and opportunities at the UW, which we'll be elaborating on later. And ultimately, our goal was to provide as many resources as possible to the Tent City 3 residents in a COVID-safe manner these days. And that's all I kind of have to say about Tent City Collective and our mission and goals. If anyone has any questions, feel free to elaborate. Thank you.
Any questions for Aaliyah from other panelists before we go on, or clarifications? All right, let us move on to introducing our friends from Tent City 3 itself. So today we are lucky to have with us two folks from Tent City 3. I hope you can see this slide. We have Orlando Latimer and Sean Smith. Orlando is from Houston, Texas, but he made his way to Seattle, where he attended Garfield High School. And he found Tent City here and fell in love with the homeless community, hoping to make it better. He admits it took him a while to get the hang of the Seattle homeless community politics here. It's a thing. He got his GED in 2018 in Seattle through the Goodwill Training Center, and he has worked in construction but hurt his back. Interested in becoming a music producer, he plans to go through a program in Florida to do that. And Sean Smith is a resident leader in the Nicholsville North Lake community. Nicholsville is an allied organization with SHARE and the Tent Cities. It operates tiny house villages. Sean has been a social justice and homeless advocate for 35 years in the Seattle area. He's worked with the Rainbow Coalition and views homeless advocacy as one of the new front lines in the civil rights movement. Denying people the human right to housing is an affront to human dignity and survival, he says. And he notes that even in many of the poor countries where he has traveled, there isn't the homelessness that you see here. All right, let me turn it over to the two of you.
So thank you, Amy. My name is Sean Smith. I'm a former organizer for Tent City 3, and I'm here with Orlando. To understand Tent City 3, you have to understand the organization behind it, that share and wield. What we are is an organization of homeless and formerly homeless men and women. Everything is self-managed, which means that not only do we make decisions, we also put the work in behind it. We run everything ourselves. We're King County's largest shelter network with 7 indoor shelters, 2 tent cities, a work for housing program, a storage program, and also now a hygiene center. So what we are not is a store or a typical social service organization. What we are is a self-help group. We started in 1990, Tent City 3 starting in 2000, and Tent City 4 in 2004. So why do we need tent cities? Well, the simple word is survival. On any given night, there are 11,000 homeless folks in Seattle with typically about 6,500 shelter beds. That means that a great many people are left to sleep in doorways, in the streets, in a safe, unsafe manner. We started Tent City 3 because we needed to come together for our own safety and security. People need a place to stay together where they don't have to carry everything on their back every place that they go. People could come and go according to their own schedules and feel safe and secure. Last year, there were 183 people that died outside, either by death or violence. It's a terrible statistic that we hope that we can put it into.
Hello, everyone. I'm Orlando Latimer. I'm here to tell you a little bit of how Tent City works. It's democratic and self-managed. 5 members, executive committee, executive bi-weekly, weekly meetings, real democracy and self-managed. Around about 40 people at Tent City 3. Most work. Some are looking for work. Some are waiting on housing. Some are in school. We have strict codes of conduct. We need sobriety and nonviolence. Those who break these codes of conduct are punished or escorted away from the premises. Screening sobriety, we make sure there's no sex offenders. Everyone signs these rules. Security works at all times, litter patrol daily. Dumpsters, porta potties, food preparation areas are all prepared for us. Meal calendars, many nights, bus tickets to get to work and appointments. I want to talk a little bit about the UW hosting experience and how was it special to me. and then I'll hand it over to Sean. My hosting experience at the UW, when I first came to Tent City 3, that was my first stop at the at UW. I had no idea about Tent City 3s or what it was about. I came in looking for a tent. I heard the cities was giving them a tent, so I made a call, asked for a tent. They said, yeah, we got some. I came down, and they said, no, we don't give out tents, but you can stay. So I decided to stay, and I enjoyed it because I was there at the UW. The interaction with the students that came down with the foot clinics, the dental, and also with the pet clinics. Most of the participants at Tent City enjoyed that. I think it was a good thing. I myself participated in almost every foot clinic. I kind of like getting my feet done. I personally think that UW hosting Tent City 3 was an excellent experience and something that should continue. I can speak for a lot of people at Tent City 3 who also believe that we have did a lot of stays, and definitely UW is one of the best ones. I would definitely hope that y'all could continue that. And I am grateful and thankful for UW for hosting us and having us there. I'll turn it over to Sean.
Thanks, Orlando. So for me, as the organizer at the time, the most unique experience was watching interaction between the students and the folks at Tent City 3. In a lot of ways, the perceptions of homelessness and how people became homeless were challenged. And I think the students got a great deal of insight on what happens for folks. You know, they realize that there is no one road to homelessness. And people from many walks of life end up homeless. So for me, that was the most rewarding experience. If there are any questions, we're open to answer. So.
All right. Was that what Chair has? Maybe that's enough for now, and we'll come back in the Q&A to see if people have any more questions for Sean and Orlando. Thank you so much for being here. Next up, I want to introduce Lois Thetford, who is faculty in the UW's Physician Assistant or Medex program. They train PAs, and she has taught basic clinical skills classes there for 17 years. She was founder of a founder of the 45th Street Clinic in Wallingford, which specializes in care of low-income marginalized populations. She's been a faculty advisor and champion of the Tent City Collective at UW since its founding. Thanks for being here, Lois. You unmute.
Unmute. It is my pleasure to unmute. I'm so happy to be here and talk to everyone. So I was aware of TCC, and in 2016, they approached me to create a course to accompany the first hosting. There were 8 courses that interacted with Tent City 3 in 2017. So our course is focused around skills for engagement and appropriate ways to provide care, whether you're a nurse or a pharmacist or a dentist or a medical provider. There are things that you should know before you interact with people about being sensitized to where they're coming from and just appropriate ways to be. So that's what our course is pretty much focused around. We do it once a year. I do it with a social worker, Charlotte Sanders, my co-chair. And we really emphasize how working with people who have multiple different healthcare challenges as well as social challenges requires a team approach. and a broader view of how you think about experience. I had been doing focused street and shelter medical outreach to people experiencing homelessness since 1985, at which time the wait for affordable housing was 2 years. It is now between 6 and 8 years that people have to wait, whether they're disabled or single parents or whatever. Housing is really a huge issue that goes way beyond what we can teach people, and requires a much larger movement across the state to really address. So we started serving homeless youth when we founded the community health clinics back in the early 70s. And with the first hosting, I got more involved with Tent City 3 and with Tent City Collective, mentoring students from the Medex program and from the class on homelessness to become leaders. So TCC met every other week, connecting with Tent City through meetings, dinners, clothing drives, helping with moves, and meeting with the administration yearly about hosting plans. Our goal was to host every other year, but it has taken longer than that to make that happen. And it's very important that the university hear from students on their desire to be hosts and to engage with activism around issues of homelessness. The students that interacted with the Tent City hosting in both 17 and 21 had very rich experiences that benefited both the residents and the students, and it was key to making it a successful hosting. There has been a lot of turnover, a lot of students graduating, but we have a strong group of survivors that has been key to making the last hosting well and planning for the next one. As a faculty advisor, I keep connected to Tent City 3. I encourage and mentor students who show interest and commitment. And I follow many people who have been former residents of Tent City 3 who are now in housing, and still connect with them, and also advocate in all aspects of my life for the right of all people to organize in their own best interests. One of the critical factors about Tent City 3 and Share is that empowerment that comes from people acting out what their best interests are. This is how I thrive. Tent City 3 has been really powerful in empowering people to be more self-activated, more satisfied with their lives, and the sense of community has been critical for helping people move on from really hard times. Whether it was Katrina, or whether it was a house fire, or whether it was any other life-changing experience, the community aspect of being a self-organized group has been very powerful in the lives of all the people that I have connected with through Tent City 3. These 4 endeavors keep me going, even when we have political setbacks, administrative setbacks, or any other kind of problem that comes up. There is so much greatness to be found in this endeavor, and I would encourage all of you to become involved.
Thank you, Lois. I notice a question in the chat from our friend Linda Isham, and it pertains to what the rules are around Tent City and how often it has to move. And maybe I would just turn to Sean to ask you to answer that question. How often does Tent City move, and with how much advance notice? and are residents involved in the host site selection process? Can you speak to that for a minute, Sean?
Certainly. So typically a stay is anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the site and the site conditions. And as far as the involvement from the residents of Tent City 3, they actually are active participants in picking out and asking sites. There's a lot of footwork that happens in behind the scenes that people don't realize. It's typically anywhere from three to 6 months to line up a new host. So, and that requires a great deal of hands, many hands, to make that possible. Again, what we are not is a staff-driven organization. We're an organization of men and women doing the work for ourselves.
Yeah. One thing I might ask you to mention also is that when you move to a new location, there is typically a community meeting to air any concerns, potential worries, anxieties that people have about homeless people, frankly.
Yeah, and in those meetings, we typically dispel a lot of the worries that folks have. You know, what we are not is a encampment on the side of the road. We're an organized group, which people find comforting and alleviating. You know,
There are
as far as
responsibilities, for example.
yes, as far as the moves go, a lot of that comes from the early on consent decree, in which we agreed with the city that our stays would be no more than 3 months at a given site. It's helped understand why we started Tent City 3 to begin with, which was to challenge the city's codification, their codification rules. The city at that time would not issue a permit for an encampment within city limits. And we chose to challenge that because there were so many people dying outside and have died since. There's simply just not enough shelter space, and people need a safe place to stay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Sean. And we have another question in the chat that I'm going to let sit there for a minute. Feel free to add your questions. I'm now going to turn to Catherine Cornforth, who works in UW engagement. And her work centers on ways to bring community-generated knowledge into university programming. So Tent City 3 is just one of many, many, many community projects that she works on, mostly through technical support for community-engaged learning courses in the undergraduate curriculum. She had a brief career managing volunteers and communications in the nonprofit world, before coming to the UW in 2007. And she has worked to support academic connections with the Tent City 3 residencies at the UW in 2017 and 2021, negotiating with faculty how to run some of these courses. So thank you for being here, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. You asked, when you asked me to be a panelist, you asked me to reflect on what the university had learned from the residencies. And I went back and looked at some notes. And so just trying to reflect on that, right? I think so often in my work, there's this tension between like institutions, like what did the UW learn? Well, really, institutions don't learn anything, right? The people within the institution learn the things. And so thinking about, right, what is the partnership, not just between community and campus, but between students who by nature are transitory, right? They should leave within 3 or 4 years of coming to us if we're doing our job. And those of us that are in administrative and teaching positions who often have longer tenure, right? Sort of how do we create an institutional memory around this this project and also still seed some of that institutional memory to student leadership, right? So that's really some of what I wanted to reflect on. Right, as Lois mentioned, in 2017, there were 8 courses that connected directly with the Tent City 3 while they were on campus. That's the ones that we formally documented though, right? Because there are lots of, with any community engagement work at the university, there are always lots of sort of little popcorn moments that are really hard to capture in our systems. And then much of the 2021 residency was sort of those informal connections because we were navigating around so much pandemic restriction and hesitation, right? And then to some of the things I've really learned, right? Sean just outlined that Tent City 3 is negotiating a move every 90 days, right? And so they are constantly hustling to build the relationships, to think about their next move 3 and 6 months out. I'm really struck by the fact that our time schedule for autumn quarter, which begins essentially in October, we have to get all of those details locked in by next week, right? So the timelines between Tent City 3 and the university as an institution are just completely divorced from each other, right? And so trying to find ways to help those two systems play with each other and speak to each other in really meaningful ways is a lot of the role that I've been able to play, right? So there are always faculty like Amy, like Lois, whose community work is so deeply enmeshed with their academic work that you all don't need my support, right? But there are other faculty who are at different places on their tenure level or who have different departmental frameworks that do need some support in thinking like how do we live into the values and sort of the civic education goals that we want to have in our classes, regardless of what sort of the academic department or other frameworks might be around the course, right? Many of us are working at the University of Washington because we care about creating people who operate in the world in a value-centered way, right? And who can make human connections, right? To address the problems that we all know exist, however we define the problems, right? So finding a way to create those moments of interpersonal connection, sometimes through formal courses and sometimes through just accidental, a student walking up to the gate at Tent City, right? But having a way and preparing Tent City residents for those unplanned interactions, right? That is some of the controlled chaos that I've been able to help manage during the Tent City residencies on campus. And so really sort of thinking about how to bring systems that operate very differently, sets of people who have very different frames on the world, right? Like still how to create moments of authentic connection through meals, through course visits, through figuring out how students can do some meaningful work in camp. But because we're an institution, that means creating systems. It means talking a lot to the camp leadership at any given moment, right? And sort of creating a way that we can still put some container around those connections, or at least around some of them, and also allow for the unexpected connections, right? So that is some of the work that I've tried to do. I'll let folks ask questions because I feel like I'm in the floaty space. Other things though that my office has brought to the table in terms of support for Tent City Collective students, right, is access to advising and connection with merit scholarships, leadership awards, both campus-based and more national and international, right? Making sure that students are not just doing amazing work, but we are supporting them in learning how to talk about that work in their own academic pursuits, in their own graduate school applications, and getting them recognition for the work that they're doing, which is a very small part of the puzzle, but it's an important part because we know our students learn so much from what they do, right? Making sure that we are helping them extract that learning through reflection. And so those are all my talking points. I'll leave it to questions from there.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We have one more speaker before we will turn to more Q&A. Sally Clark, in some ways, is sort of our secret weapon in this project. She is the UW's Director of Regional and Community Relations, which sounds innocent enough. But she describes her role as decider, facilitator, cajoler, convener, broker, and provoker. And I have just been in awe of how she has managed to wrangle and orchestrate the Tent City 3 stays. She does not let any detail go unmentioned and yet keeps the whole big picture in mind at the same time. So it's sort of a remarkable balancing act. Just to talk a little about her history, she served as a Seattle City Council member for 9 years and was program director for Lifelong AIDS Alliance between 2004 and 2006, and was a legislative aide to King County Council in 2002. So she knows her politics, and Tent City 3 is a bit of a political project. She earned her BA in political science and her master's in public administration from the UW.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. So I will, I'll talk about some of what may be kind of the boring logistics, but as you think about how institutions say yes to things, it is sometimes wrapping your arms around the boring logistics that get you to yes, because you're certainly dealing with folks either in your own units, your own departments, or in the executive departments at the university, who, you know, they're very interested in doing a zillion different things. And there is a zillion different things that are presented to them all the time as great opportunities for student engagement. But it's the ones that have a particular set of traits that come together, some of which are in your control and some of which are out. You know, it's been mentioned earlier that there was a previous president where a proposal had been made, and that previous president, I was not here at the time, my understanding is took that proposal, it went through a review of some kind, and the answer came out, no. This isn't something that is a thing that we're interested in the campus taking on at this time. And you have a different set of factors happening now, where you have a president who has a different focus for her own research, right? Her own research is focused around homelessness and homeless youth. Her interests are very grounded at the University of Washington. She's not someone who has come in from another university or is thinking about those different factors about where presidents, what kinds of things presidents are trying to do when they're trying to go someplace else. That's not a very kind way of saying it, but I think in looking at how we kind of talked, and Amy provided some of the questions to think about here to kind of frame the administrative part of it. You know, how did the agreement come to be? What kinds of resistance came into play? I think you had a particularly incredible group of students. And all of the students who I've encountered and worked with who have been a part of these Tent City 3 opportunities have been great. The crew of students who really pushed this over the top for the first hosting was pretty advanced, and they really took it on themselves. They took on a lot of the community outreach. They took on putting together a very coherent and great proposal for doing it. I took it upon myself to try to connect with them pretty early, because I was like, yeah, these guys seem pretty good. I think they might actually make a proposal. It might actually be pretty good. We should probably start learning about that so that we're not just like on our heels when that comes in. And that, you know, that what we were able to do while that proposal, when I started meeting quietly with that group, I was able to say to the president's office, you know, we should start taking a look again legally at, can we do this? So that's the first thing that your crew is always going to look at. Legally, can we do this? And that is not a slam dunk answer. You know, Amy, you referenced that the 2 universities in this area who have done it previously are religiously based organizations. So you've got Seattle University and Seattle Pacific University. Those are very particular pieces of the land, And I love talking about the land use code. We could go on and on. Those are particular pieces of the land use code in the city of Seattle, where churches have a much wider ability to use their property for their purposes, for what they consider connected to the church's purposes, a much wider ability to do that with a much lower threshold of regulatory hoops that you have to go through. University of Washington is different, right? Everybody across the entire state of Washington thinks they know what the University of Washington's campus property is intended for. Everybody thinks they know. And so there was the technical challenge of legally, can we do this? Politically, what might it mean to some of the folks who don't love the university in places like Olympia and other places? Will this get taken out on us in some way? And that legal answer came back as, yeah, you can probably do it if you're mission connected. And this will come back to the future challenges here as Tent City Collective or others come together to think about how can you obtain a more certain and predictable schedule for hosting. That tension of, is it always mission connected? Is there always a student and faculty component that is driving the hosting is fundamental. And that's whether President Kause is here or whether, when a future president is here, it will always come back to, it can never just be a place where Tent City 3 shows up. And so that's something to always keep in mind as you're thinking about what's your pitch, what's your proposal, how is it grounded in the mission of the university. I mentioned that, especially with the first hosting, the Tent City Collective students were really out there. They met with community groups. And we also, if you remember, we did that in a two-step process. President Kause was inclined to do it and announced in the spring, we're inclined to do this. Tell us what you think, which is always one of the things where I'm like, oh, do I really want to know what people think? Yes, it's the right thing to do. Hundreds of responses came in. Hundreds of responses. And I would say if we went back and looked, I'd say 95% of those were positive. This is a great idea. Let's do it. 5% of those were people who had very well articulated, and many of them were our campus community in Seattle. They were not folks out in Woodinville, although there were a number of parents who would be in the outer ring communities. But a lot of them were our campus community who have the questions that I think we're all still wrestling with in the greater Seattle area with the explosion of unsheltered folks living outdoors, often with behavioral health crises and drug or alcohol crises commingling, where you've got people who don't know what to make of that. And there's a fear, there's a fear and chaos cycle that plays together there. And so certainly a number of the Seattle campus community said, this is a terrible idea. We don't think that you should invite this to our campus. What will you two do to ensure that those of us who walk around campus will be okay when this happens? And Tent City Collective students and faculty did, there was a lot of brainstorming. There were 3 open meetings to talk with people, and that was done with Tent City Collective, with Tent City 3. And so having that combined approach of talking to the community together about who Tent City 3 is, because you still had a lot of people, and you would still have that if we announced it today, a lot of people who are like, oh my God, I can't believe you're inviting people who live under I-5 to come camp on campus. That's where some people immediately go. And it's so much more powerful to have the Tent City Collective and Tent City 3 standing up together to say, who is Tent City 3? What is its history? What's its track record? What are their commitments? And that was really powerful. And I think it made a huge difference. A couple of other things, just I don't want to leave out the logistics part of it because it is a huge group of people that make the hosting possible. And it also brings up a couple of challenges for future hosting. For folks who may, we could do a bingo card. So we talked about the legal review. That happens. There ends up being a memorandum of agreement that is signed between the university and Tent City 3. And that's for anybody who would be on university property for some period of time. And it lays out everybody's rights and responsibilities with each other, the insurance requirements, the move-in date, the move-out date, who's providing the water, where is the fencing going to go, what is the site. And there's a great team of folks who work in UW facilities and UW real estate and the UW Attorney General's office division who are really so great at that. And they're problem solvers. They like an interesting challenge. That has to happen every time. And it's always, it's fine. We have a pattern for how to do it now. The first time we created it, I'm like, I don't know. I guess we need an MOA. We should start drafting that. Was it? Anybody have one? The use of university facilities process is always a challenge just because of the timing. And it was a challenge this last time because of COVID and when was the group meeting. And so Tent City Collective students and faculty did a great job of keeping track of what was a weird ethereal target of how you get before the UUF committee. The community engagement part that happens during the hosting is also fundamentally important in Tent City Collective and Tent City 3. And then we invite, particularly for the site that we've used in West Campus there, we invite the neighboring businesses as well as housing and food services and College of the Environment to all be a part of a weekly meeting. And that the best thing is that each of those weekly meetings is just a snoozer. Like nothing to report, nothing to see here, everything's fabulous. And that's what's happened both times, right? We've only had, I can't even think of a handful of cases where somebody has said, yeah, here's something that didn't get addressed. I should say UWPD participates in those meetings as well. And their people have been outstanding about connecting with Tent City 3, about having there be a face-to-face relationship, understanding what's needed and what's wanted from each other, and just having somebody they can talk with. And I think we've had 1 or 2 cases where Tent City 3 has had to 86 somebody and wanted to make sure that UWPD knew about that since the person would be leaving the campus area. Briefly, and then I'll stop talking, when I think about what are the challenges ahead for the future, I don't know if it's permanent, but definitely for the next couple of years, that site that has been used previously in West Campus, what we call the W35 parking lot, is not available. So the background on that is that the UW's Herring Center, which is an education component in South Campus down by the hospital, the good news is they received a huge gift to renovate the Herring Center. Fabulous. Bad news is everybody's out in portables, and those portables are set up on W35 for the next, I have the calendar someplace, but it's until next summer, summer after, as they do the rehab. It's a major rehab. So there will have to be a site review and a site selection process when Tent City 3 is hosted again. And I was trying to go back and find what the commitment was about whether it's winter of 22 or whether it was winter of 23. But Amy or someone's got that in their email about when. I think this summer is when a site selection process would have to be cranked up in order to find a place. And I'll tell you, it's not, even though the University of Washington Seattle campus is a big place, in order to find a spot that in the winter is hardscape, is relatively close to usable transit, has water, fresh water, has a way for electricity to be provided, and is a minimum of 10,000 square feet in a usable footprint, not a weird gerrymandered footprint. It's harder than you think. And so that process will be a challenging one when it does get picked up this spring and summer. I guess the other thing that I will say that I've heard about as a challenge, and SU, Father Steve has moved on. I don't know that the new president knows much about their previous history with that. SU has a new president now. What we had kind of heard anecdotally was that the more often SPU has hosted, the degree of student and faculty engagement has declined each time. And that's something to think about. That's just something for the UW group to think about what is it that engages people? What is it that keeps it as something that is a valuable connection? And that will be, again, important in terms of grounding future projects in the mission in order to justify. I'll stop talking there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Sally. It was very important that you be here for this. There are some questions in the chat. My intention had been to talk a little bit about what students found during their evaluations of the stays, but maybe that's less important than the Q&A. Just to say, they did go through an interesting process of establishing a logic model with some very clear short, medium, and long-term goals, which were central to the evaluation process to determine whether there was a success. And also just to say that they did do widespread online surveying of faculty, students, and staff, and found people largely supportive of the stay and also largely supportive of hosting again. So let me just turn now to the questions in the chat. But just to remind you that this, again, is the first of a series of 3 4 seminars that the program is going to put together. The next one is February 16th at noon, which is to feature our friends Seema Cliff-Asepi and Caleb Bantagreen with the UW's harm reduction program and psychiatry program to talk about meeting people where they are, harm reduction approaches for people experiencing homelessness. So that'll be our next one up. So a couple questions in the chat. Doug Conrad asked about how people move out of tent city into more permanent housing. Addie asked, what's the reasoning for the 90-day stay? And Marianne Mercer asks, how does Tent City Initiative relate to the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness? I'll just say to the latter one, I went to that coalition meeting yesterday. They are having a Tuesday advocacy meeting for anybody interested in advocating for homeless policy changes and legislation every Tuesday during the legislative session. And Tent City 3 wasn't in the room, but everyone's welcome at that. It's a very big tent, shall we say, the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness. So maybe turn it back over to Sean in Orlando to talk about people moving out of Tent City into permanent supportive housing.
Sure, I can tackle that question. So again, I'll reiterate, what we are not is a social service program. That doesn't mean that folks from Tent City 3 don't get into permanent housing, because they do. Typically, what happens at Tent City 3 is program referrals happen peer-to-peer. Somebody will learn about a program, and then they'll share it with the community around them. And literally, we have seen thousands of people get into housing because of that process.
Orlando, anything to add to that? Okay. Kara is asking, is there allowed to be set up a rotational system for where they stay so that you can reliably know where the next stay will be in advance?
So, and that also goes into the question, why the 90 days? So when Tent City 3 first started, and we got the codification from the city, or the consent decree, we agreed to 90 days in any site because of the permitting process that was set up. But typically, especially in religious communities, people use their property. It's very difficult to give up one's parking lot for more than 90 days and still have an active religious community. So this is part of the reasoning behind what seems like a short stay, but it's typically a quarter. However, there are sites where we can stay up to 6 months. It's rare that we get those.
Yeah.
It's rare that people would give up their property for that amount of time.
All right, people, we are at our hour. I think this was a really fun and important conversation. We hope it paves the way for the UW to make a commitment to a future stay. I am currently teaching a class on homelessness winter quarter. We've got about 60 students who join us every Friday morning. People are welcome to sit in on that when we're on Zoom, especially. The more the merrier. So let me know at my address, hagopian@uw.edu, if anybody wants to engage further in this. Thank you to all the people who came. Thank you so much to David Grabowski for having the CHIPS program host us. Thank you to Sally for the UW's commitment to this work. Thank you to Catherine for wrangling faculty and students. Thank you to Aaliyah for organizing students to support Tent City 3. Thank you, Lois, for your faculty leadership, who you're an inspiration to all of us, and to especially Sean and Orlando for being such wonderful partners in this work. It was wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much.